Hello, welcome to this week's episode of Musical Talk. My name is Nick Hudson. This week you're going to be hearing a discussion I had about Hamilton with Professor Robert Gordon and Dr. Olaf Bean, who are both university lecturers in the world of musical theatre. And it's a really enlightening discussion, so let's get on with that. So I'm sat here with my good friends, Professor Robert Gordon from Goldsmiths. Hello, Robert. How are you?
Hello, I'm fine, Nick. Thank you.
And Olaf, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Olaf Bean. I'm Professor of Musical Theatre and Media Studies at Regent's University, London.
We want to talk about Hamilton because it's been a couple of weeks, and I'm always fascinated by this show because it's had its honeymoon period in London, do you think? And it's settled in, and it's still doing very well. You both have seen it recently, yes. And your first time, or
our first time? Yes.
Yeah,
I've seen a bootleg of it before, so I knew the show, but I haven't seen it on stage live. So in London, it was the very first time to see it.
Can I go first? Because I'm going to put forward a very negative opinion, but I think that will be quite controversial among listeners.
Everyone, yeah.
To the podcast. Yes, because although I have spoken to others in London who have agreed with me to a certain extent, I think Olaf takes a more positive view of the show. I went to the show without having read the Hamilton. I didn't know very much about it except what it was about. I've heard people talking about it at conferences, and I've watched online the concerts that Lin-Manuel Miranda has done after the show for people who've queued up and haven't got in, and read some of their the posts that the blogs that they've written where he appears almost as a Christ-like figure. I've also found it rather strange to see audiovisual material of people who did get in crying through the show.
And that's all the American stuff.
That's all the American.
Not
That's
so much
all
here.
Exactly. That's what happened in New York before it opened in London. Now, I've also heard that Americans are paying up to $900 for a ticket. So I could say, I suppose, that I was prejudiced because
you cried too if you had to pay $900 for Hamilton.
Yes, I might cry, but I'd cry to my bank manager rather than in the theatre. What I found is that the show has been hyped beyond belief. That actually there are points of interest in the show, but that I found, as I thought, perhaps I was prejudiced, but I had been expecting the show to combine the kind of hip-hop style that you get so brilliantly used in the Heights with a slice of American history. What I find contradictory and complicated and difficult about the show, in fact, because it verges to me on the hypocritical, is...
Hypocritical, even.
Hypocritical. Hypocritical, perhaps. But I think that what I find difficult to swallow is the fact that the show, which uses a mixed-race cast all the way, which is in some ways a good thing, but that seems to suggest that the history of the American founding fathers and the early history of the United States of America was one where all races were welcome, when in fact we know that the people who actually were writing the Constitution owned slaves. And this is not clearly stated in the piece itself, and it's not clearly stated that Hamilton himself was a slave owner. And there is a line where Hamilton says he's against slavery, but actually he wasn't against slavery historically, he was against the slave trade. And that's something very different. He owned slaves. So I feel the show distorts history, and I wasn't quite so taken, after about the second or third number, I wasn't quite so taken with the hip-hop either. And then, of course, I began to sit and think about the show's underrepresentation of women and the show's pretense that it was doing something very politically radical.
It seems to be a lot like The Greatest Showman in the fact that Barnum himself was a supporter. He had slaves and things, and now, along with Hamilton, they're sort of idolised as these great figures, and that's what these kind of musicals seem to do.
I think what we have to differentiate here are two elements. First of all, it's the hype, which I think hasn't helped any musical ever when it comes to critical evaluation.
The hype seems to die down here.
It seems to have died down here, and of course, whenever there's a hype, there's also a backlash, and there was a little bit of a backlash in the United States once people started talking about the roles of the women, and of course that certain historical elements are not really seriously discussed. But on the other hand, I'd like to just sort of go back a little bit.
Can I just say, Olaf here has about 40 pages of notes that I'm very, very impressed with. We've never had anyone so prepared for an episode ever, I think.
Well, it's because I, in order to discuss it with students, worked my way through the Hamilton, and let me first point out what I think works very well about the show before we can go back to some of the criticism that Robert has pointed out. On the one hand, I think what you clearly can see is that Lin-Manuel Miranda knows his Broadway and West End history, and that he is very inclusive in the way that he sort of takes what he thinks are the best ideas from whatever came before him. So there's a lot of Sondheim in the way that he tries to straddle politics and the personal. There is the reference to the big London shows, Les Mis, but most obviously, of course, and a lot of people have pointed that out, what is most obviously taken from somebody else is the structure of the show. Structure of the show, because clearly the setup of Burr sort of being the counterpart of Hamilton is taken from Jesus Christ Superstar. Also the idea that a lot of the story is told through the antagonist's eyes. That's also is taken from Jesus Christ Superstar.
If I can just interrupt for a moment, I think Burr turned out to be a much more interesting character in the piece than Hamilton himself.
Well, that's also true for Jesus Christ Superstar. A lot of people would argue that Judas is the much more interesting role than Jesus.
Superstar.
Yes, it should be, but of course that would have caused even more controversy. I think that when Lin-Manuel Miranda is good, he's very good, but there are moments when I feel that it doesn't quite work the way he intended, and I'm also a little bit more skeptical about the claim that he shows how hip-hop can be used in musical theatre, because for me one of the great problems of the show, if you want to call it that, is that it proves one thing to me, and that is that hip-hop is good for narrative sections, but it has problems when it's supposed to dramatize what is happening. So what you would have in Hamilton are a lot of songs, sometimes brilliantly written, with people
always brilliantly written. I think,
no, there are one or two that I think are really awful.
Fair
And we'll come back to that a little later, or at least sort of certain sections that don't work for me. Let's put it like this: is that you have a character stepping forward and then telling us what happened instead of showing us by dramatizing it.
But don't you think he's? I mean, the argument for him using hip hop and rap has always been that these stories are about gun dueling and they are about people at war and stuff, and it's still something that happens in the hip hop world. He is mirroring a lot of these hip hop battles that go on where people will just. So do you think that has an element to it?
I think it works brilliantly if you have something like the numbers where they explain the dual regulations, where I think there it works wonderful. Also the cabinet battles, I think this is also where it works very nicely. But otherwise, very often people just step to the front, like I remember at the beginning he said, I'm this, here's that, and then blah, blah, blah.
Isn't that the Brechtian style, though?
I think as the rest of the show doesn't really work as Brechtian theatre. Partly because it doesn't give you enough facts, it doesn't give you anything that sort of engages your intellect to the degree that Bertolt Brecht would have pointed out.
No contextual historical detail.
Yeah, what you would argue is that you have some elements that used to be called alienation techniques, but that nowadays don't alienate anyone because we've seen them so many times. So
the other good use of hip-hop is that it takes a very, very, very long complicated story and it does condense it into an evening.
Yes, but on the other hand, it puts an enormous pressure on the performers, meaning that every little detail has to be heard, and as good as some of them are, there are inevitably certain sections where you do not understand what's happening, and that is sometimes just a miscalculation. But I think the other element that sort of the hip-hop style forces on us, and I found this rather I wasn't completely convinced by how it was solved, is that it seems to me this is why you have never-ending movement in the show. There's always somebody moving around, the chorus in one way or another. It's partly because otherwise the show would be static. It's just somebody standing at the front telling us things. And so there have to be the chorus has to be choreographed. There has to be movement in one way or another in order to give you the feeling that the show is moving.
It's very much like a music video as well, a lot of it I found.
It is. It's certainly beautifully put together. The lighting is wonderful. I'm not entirely convinced by the set, but... well, it's this typical... I think a trend that you have in New York more and more, and that is that you have one set that stays the way it is, without scene or set changes. But there are certain...
Like that thing set in a pub, what was it?
Once. You also have that in...
Come From Away.
Come From Away, but you also had it in... American Idiot, Spring Awakening.
Yeah.
So it's the one thing that where you think, yeah, it's nice to have one.
Hamilton needed more floating chairs. That's what I thought.
Can I just interrupt for one moment and say I did not find the lyrics so startlingly innovative, which I was led to believe they were going to be. I thought you can't rhyme like Cole Porter or Noel Coward. Lin-Manuel, you can't. You don't do it. And I thought, if this was judged against the standards of the best rap and hip-hop music, you find very often brilliant rhymes and brilliant use of contemporary idiom in rhyme in some of the real rappers. And I didn't think that was so in this. I thought that the actual technical expertise of the rap didn't match up to what the best rap and hip-hop artists do.
I slightly disagree with that, but there's one other point that I think is important when it comes to Alexander Hamilton and sort of the hype. One of the questions I always ask my students is, can you tell me after seeing the show what made Alexander Hamilton brilliant and what made him so important in American history? And what the show points out is it was mostly his financial intelligence and the way that he sort of changed the economic system of the United States.
You've got to give him credit for giving us credit, is one of the lines,
yes, that's one of the things. But how exactly did he do that? Does anybody come out being able to say, okay, this is what Alexander Hamilton
200 years
did?
After he died, it was a massive musical that brought loads of money to New York. That's surely how he did it.
Well, it's on the one hand, of course, it's also wonderful that it brings in a young audience, but I am also very critical of the way that the Hamilton producer have raised ticket prices. Their explanation that they're doing this in order to give away a number of tickets for very little via the Hamilton lottery
by hype and
by
social
hype.
media.
It's actually, if you're looking at it, doesn't ring true, doesn't make sense, because if they were still just aiming for the same box office receipts at the end of the week that you would have had before Hamilton entered that theatre, whether it's the one in New York or whether it's the Victoria Palace here in London, but they have record-breaking runs because the ticket prices in general are ridiculously high. And so a show that claims to be all-inclusive actually leaves out an enormous amount of audiences because in the end it would still only appeal to those who can afford it.
Now, you've translated musicals.
Yes.
Would something like Hamilton be impossible to translate?
No, it wouldn't be impossible, it would just be very difficult. But then if you can translate James Joyce and Shakespeare, you can certainly translate Lin-Manuel Miranda. There might be other elements that come in there, the whole question of whether there is an audience for this. Of course, there have been German rappers, there have been particularly important French rappers, but still you would need somebody who really has a feeling for language for doing that. So if you have someone, I think it would be possible.
My view on Hamilton is it's a very boring story told very well. Do you think there's...
I think some of it is very exciting. The bits that I think do not work well are certainly the bit about his son, who I think is a...
Who just goes out and dies and gets shot.
And there's also the one element that I personally find very problematic, and that is, why are we supposed to care about people who are stupid enough to go to duels?
Exactly.
You just think, okay, after the first person dies, you might have learned your lesson, but no, they continue doing that, and I know it was all supposed to be about honor, but if you think if that is a way to sort of present honor today, you might as well think, well, then we might also write a musical about honor killings.
But the duel is the only way in the show that Lin-Manuel Miranda and the Lin-Manuel Miranda has to ratchet up the tension, because there is no source of narrative tension in the show at all, apart from who's going to die in the duel.
Well, there is the idea of him moving up the social ladder, which is interesting. And there are some narrative devices that I think are very well handled, and one of them is, of course, the scene where everything turns backwards.
Yes, I thought that was very, very clever.
To reveal the love of his sister-in-law for him.
Has that been done before, to your...
Not in that way. Of course, people have fiddled around with time
and
in musical
flashbacks
theatre and flashback, but the way this has been staged and then allows us to get a new
It reminds me
take
a
on
bit
it.
of Groundhog Day, in the fact that you take something we've seen before and have it from a different
that's
angle.
true. And it's very nice. But I think then we move into the next rather problematic element, and that is the role of women in the show. And he has said a lot, also in the Hamilton, how he tried to make the characters interesting.
The Hamilton is, for those of you who don't know, is...
The Hamilton is a collection of the show's lyrics with essays and short articles about the people who devised it, about the people who have performed in it, and sort of
He's finishing the hat in a way.
Charting the history of the show from the early development to the first off-Broadway performance and then the move to Broadway. And one of the big problems with that book is that it really already is dabbling very seriously in myth-making. Lin-Manuel Miranda is compared several times, usually by other people, to Michael Jackson, Shakespeare, to Barack Obama. He's called a genius so many times. And you think, well, all of that would be more convincing if you didn't have to state it every second page. And you think what happens here is that everybody, including the media, latched on Lin-Manuel Miranda and turned him into, and I sort of agree with Robert here, to this Christ-like figure who saves musical theatre. And one of the elements where this happens is, of all places, Hamilton, where suddenly he said, we have to grant him that he saved American musical theatre. American musical theatre didn't need to be saved. From what? Well, if at all, from shows like Hamilton.
Well, the Book of Mormon is doing pretty well still, so that didn't need saving.
Well, Wicked is doing well. There are always shows that do well, and there are always some that fail. But of course, it is that Hamilton has done so exceedingly well that, and partly because there was this hype of the media, because everybody had to say something about it. Another element that I think we should talk about is whether or not the show has long-lasting appeal outside of the United States, because what is at stake for audiences?
I give it 3 or 4 years here. Yeah. Until it tours and things. I think the Americans will see it because it's cheaper to fly to London and see it than it is to see it on Broadway. I think theatre people rush to see it immediately and they will go back. But as I always say, would your neighbours go and see it? Or would they go and see Mamma Mia instead?
Well, I'd rather see Mamma Mia, to be honest.
Well, I would argue that as it doesn't really give you that much insight into American history when it comes down to it, there's nothing that you can take away from the show apart from the fact that it may have been an interesting character, that Burr maybe was an even more interesting character.
I think you leave Hamilton proud of the fact that you've seen Hamilton. I think that's a lot.
I have to say that, and this is not meant to be cynical, but I learned more from a Wikipedia article about Hamilton, about Alexander Hamilton, than I learned from the show, because I learned a number of facts about him, which you can glean from the show, but they're sort of disguised there among a great deal of myth-making. And I think that that's what I resented, that if you are supposedly taking such an important subject and making this revolutionary musical by using hip-hop and rap to dramatize it, then we do expect to learn something important. And I think history teachers have been using it to make history classes more lively in America. But I think, yes, I can understand why they do. But then they have to actually give their students an enormous amount of contextual information, which isn't actually clearly given in the show.
Yeah, but then you could argue the same happened to all. I remember when I was at school, we had to watch those Roman epics like Cleopatra and Quo Vadis in order to learn about the Roman Empire. And of course, every teacher then has to add to that, because whatever you think of the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra, it's certainly not historically correct.
Yes, but the thing is, those shows were not touted by anybody. They were largely ridiculed in terms of their historical sensibility, even at the time. And they were not touted as shows that were revelatory insights into history. Yeah. And this show is.
But then who's doing the touting? That's the other question we might need to ask. Who is doing the touting? And once again, coming back to your comment that people are proud to have seen Hamilton, that is also not new. You had that with as early as South Pacific. There was somebody who manufactured false ticket stubs so that you could put them on a coffee table and pretend to have seen South Pacific. And you think, well, and that also certainly historically is very questionable as a show. But once again, you think, well, nothing is new in musical theatre, I'm afraid. And what I would credit Lin-Manuel Miranda with is that he has shown that you can use hip-hop and rap in a certain way, as long as you also, and we need to make that clear, adhere to the general rules of musical theatre, Broadway narrative shows, because he uses that in order to give us the story. So it's not formally that radical.
But in that sense, In the Heights is a far better show, because he manages to use the rap and the hip-hop in a very exciting way that illuminates that story and doesn't pretend to dramatize history.
I thought the story of In the Heights, I couldn't tell you what it was about at all.
I could tell you, but I wish not to, because I think it's wonderful as a portrayal of the neighborhood, but the book is very problematic, and in the end, a lot of it just peters out. So I hope they actually sort of have a close look at it.
But
when
the
they
book
do
of
that.
Hamilton is extremely problematic. As you yourself have said, there isn't really a narrative that grips you all the way through.
That's what you have said. I think I would argue that I was intrigued by it, I enjoyed watching it, but in the end I still have my reservations. To be honest, one of the problems I had with the show in London is that the guy who plays Hamilton has no stage presence for me. Burr completely blew him off that stage, and yes, he was very tall. He was also...
He didn't look young, scrappy and hungry from where I was.
I didn't sit that close.
Well, you see, it might have been different if one had seen Lin-Manuel Miranda in that role, because then one might have seen the way that role was envisaged to be played.
I'm not sure, to honest. I'm not sure, because Lin-Manuel Miranda is certainly a very charming guy, but he's not the handsome womanizer that Hamilton is supposed to be.
But has there ever been, apart from possibly Noel Coward, someone who would write, compose, do lyrics, do book, and star in their own show?
The comparison with Noel Coward is apt. I think he's the only other person.
Yeah. And you got to give him credit for that.
Anthony Newley comes closest.
Yes. Anthony Newley would be another one.
He still had Leslie Brookus by his side, didn't he?
Yes, that's true. In that respect, he is certainly a very
second to Noel Coward.
Yeah. Yes, and in a way, of course, he also, and that's what makes him interesting. He knows who he can write for, so that he knows what the person can deliver.
And even Coward didn't actually star in his own musicals.
Right.
He starred mainly in his own plays.
Sometimes in his reviews.
In the reviews, yes.
Yeah, but no, that's a very good point.
It must be massive pressure for Lin-Manuel Miranda now to write something.
Yes.
Bigger and better than this,
and you think that is also something that hasn't helped anyone. You know, once you're going and that, and also what I fear, what will happen is the inevitable backlash. Whatever comes after Hamilton will be regarded as a rehash, a letdown, whatever.
The same thing happened to Andrew Lloyd Webber after Phantom,
but that started even earlier. But then it happened to Stephen Sondheim after Sweeney Todd. Whenever something has gone to such heights in public estimation, critical estimation. I think he's quite clever that he hasn't announced a project yet, but that he's doing acting in films, that he's sort of...
He doesn't need to do anything.
No, he certainly doesn't need to. But
isn't he doing new songs for Disney films? Or
yes, he's doing... that's what has been announced. He will write with Alan Menken new songs.
Along with Pasek and Paul.
The new songs for the live action, however that will work out, version of The Little Mermaid. And I think it would be wonderful for that. I liked his songs for Moana, even though I think musically they were not quite up to the same level as Alan Menken, but they certainly will make for a wonderful songwriting team. And of course he will be in the new Mary Poppins films. He certainly has a lot of projects, and he also will do the film version of In the Heights, and there inevitably, sooner or later, will be a film version of Hamilton, but as with Wicked, it probably will not appear until 2035 or whatever, when the Broadway show is no longer bringing in as much money as it does. So, but once again, coming back, I wonder whether British audiences feel a relation to this. It was astonishing that American newspapers wondered, will the Brits accept the portrayal of King George? Because it's so critical. Of course the Brits love it. It's making fun of the royals.
You got the biggest applause of the whole...
Yes, and it is a funny number. It's wonderfully performed by Michael Gibson, and it's actually one of my favourite numbers on the show. But of course they're happy. It would be difficult, it would be different if it was a show that sort of criticises the Queen, for instance.
And that song was not hip-hop at all.
No,
it was pure musical comedy.
It was more the Monkees and that kind of 1960s, even though the Monkees weren't British, it was that kind of Britpop sound.
And in that respect, he knows what he's doing. Yeah. So he knows what sort of prestige to bring in, and I would always grant him that. I'm just a little bit concerned, both for the show and for himself, that this incredible hype has developed, and once again, didn't ask for it. Of course, everybody's happy that it makes that much money as it does, and it wouldn't without the hype. But on the other hand, that doesn't help any artist, because the pressure is immense.
When I saw the show, talking about British audience, when I saw the show, it was clear that the people around me who were applauding more or less before it started knew every note and every line of the show already. So I think that the audience that's been going in the first 18 months are the fans from the internet. It'll be interesting to see, once those are exhausted, can it run in London?
Yeah, and that's why I think the story is more of a problem if you want to export it to other countries than is the hip-hop style. Because basically, as I said, you don't learn that much about Alexander Hamilton. Do we really care about the Founding Fathers as much? You wonder, why isn't there a musical about the people who founded Serbo Croatia? And you think, well, clearly there could be a great musical about that, but on the other hand, who would be the audience?
But also, I think there is the only reason it could, in some ways, attract an English audience, apart from the hip-hop, is that it is about George IV. And so, well, the joke about George IV and the joke about the American War of Independence is the British fought the American War of Independence against the local Americans. And so that has some reference to British history. In Germany, this has no reference to anything. In France, this has no reference to anything.
Yeah, that's a very good
Jefferson's
point.
He comes back.
Yes,
which leads me on. It was a lot funnier than I thought it was going to be.
There are some very good jokes. I have to say, one of the other elements that to me has been hyped and that I don't see answered is the choreography, which is certainly not my kind of choreography. And as I said, it seems at times just to be there in order to mask the fact that there's no drama going on. But as I think about most of the performances, costumes, the lighting is brilliant.
Yes.
It's very well done. And it certainly has a nice atmosphere here in London, because the restored Victoria Palace Theatre looks splendid. But there's one other thing that I think we should talk about, and that is that whole ridiculous bit here in London about making sure that nobody can tout the tickets. I mean, just think, if what you have to go through in order to get finally into the theatre, there are no paper tickets, just to make sure that you can't resell them, and just think, well, go on the internet on any night. You can get tickets for Hamilton for whatever price you want to pay. So clearly this isn't working. And so the whole idea that it's sort of like you are more carefully searched than if you enter Windsor Palace. You think
the Victoria Palace.
Yeah, there you go. So somebody clearly has lost the plot here.
I mean, it's a great show. I will happily sit and listen to some of the songs, but I did fade away during some moments of the show, because it's a lot of stuff to be thrown at you. But yet you're saying it's not enough that's thrown at you. What would be the balance? I
think that he tries to cram in an enormous bit, and of course he tries to cram in the whole history. But I think what for me was lacking was more detailed information about what really made him brilliant. It wasn't enough for me that was young, scruffy and hungry, or whatever that line.
Scrappy.
Scrappy and hungry. Yeah, but that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to know, what exactly did he do? How did he convince Washington and other people to listen to him?
How did he help to win the war?
Yes, what exactly was going on also during the war? There's not enough information about this either. Then there is this rather strange episode of him having an affair, that sort of comes in and goes away within one scene. There is, and of course, yes, the death of the son is very crucial to his life, but I think that is especially badly handled. I think the scene where Philip pretends to be 7-year-old reciting that dreadful poem is enough for anyone to want to shoot him. And so I think at certain crucial moments for me in the dramaturgy, the show doesn't deliver enough information for somebody who doesn't know that much about Alexander Hamilton to begin with.
Do you think the flaw is, because as far as I'm aware, Lin-Manuel Miranda read this book about the biography of Alexander Hamilton, and he started to write songs first. Do you think it was a case of, I've written some songs, I now need to put them together to tell a story?
I think the problem here, I think you're right in that. It seems to me similar to the problem that Tim Rice had when writing chess. He thinks in songs and scenes, but he doesn't think in overall narrative. And this
and the
is
same with Evita and Jesus Christ Superstar?
No, but because there it was different because you already had a narrative.
The historical
you had
events.
the Gospels for Jesus Christ Superstar, and you had the life
but you
of
have the
Peron.
biography for Hamilton.
Yes, but the thing is that still it seems he started, as you say, writing certain songs about it. And in chess, he didn't really have a plot. He just knew
Still
that
doesn't, as far as I can see.
that's a problem. And so I think at times there are moments when I feel it's not enough for people to step forward and say, oh, this is what happened, the room where it happened. And another element, and I think this is also something that I like about the show, is that one of the things it does do is question the idea of history and teaching history and what constitutes the history that we accept.
But Wicked does that.
Wicked does that as well.
Wonderful.
That's certainly true. But on the other hand, Wicked is set in Oz. And I don't mean Australia. And the thing is that, of course, Lin-Manuel does this with history, American history, and in that respect, I think it can be used as a useful tool in history classes to ask you, what do we know about those people, and why do we know what we know, and why is it that certain accounts of Alexander Hamilton have sort of stayed in the public eye while others have faded?
I think if it hadn't been for the hype, I would have enjoyed this as an ambitious and interesting experiment that ultimately failed, but that was very experimental. But I think the hype has made me expect a masterpiece, and it isn't a masterpiece.
Is it comparable to when Les Mis came? Because there's obviously...
No, because when Les Mis started, it had the most appalling reviews of almost any show in the 80s. This has had raves from the
I think what you have here is also that I found it very strange that some of the reviewers don't notice any of the flaws of Hamilton, but then go overboard to criticize other shows and other productions. And you think, well, once again, they also have fallen victim to them. And they also don't want to criticize something that is supposed to be a hit and something that is so popular with young people.
But it's also interesting, 'cause it's interesting that you bring up Les Mis, because Lin-Manuel Miranda himself has said that Les Mis was one of his models, which I think is interesting, because he saw that that's a way to tell, okay, it's a novel, but it is a novel that includes historical elements. And that he was interested in that, because obviously he's kept, as Olaf said, he's kept a wide-ranging interest in all sorts of different models of musical theatre from the past and brought that into the show, whether or not you think it succeeds. But I think that, again, most of the reviewers who reviewed it and raved wouldn't be caught dead saying anything good about Les Mis.
Yeah.
It all, I mean, it goes back and it references Gilbert and Sullivan and stuff like that, but how do you think the show would work if it wasn't hip-hop and it was done 18th century American music?
I don't know. Well, the thing is, first of all, if you think, does a musical that is set in the past need historically accurate music? Then you say anything from The King and I would be thrown out for being
The Greatest
inaccurate.
Showman.
Yes, The Greatest Showman. But and I think also that is one of the nice things about musical theatre is that it can, being popular theatre, it needs to respond to the here and now. And you can always credit Lin-Manuel Miranda of bringing in people to the theatre that usually wouldn't go and see Hello Dolly and wouldn't actually go and see Rodgers and Hammerstein. And if you had just had a look around at the Victoria Palace, the average age of the audience is a lot younger than... Well, the last time I saw South Pacific at the Barbican, the average age must have been 70, which is a pity, but still there it is.
They're probably all dead now.
Yeah, that's it. But then also one of the things that could be good about this is that it brings in an audience, and hopefully it will make them interested in seeing more shows. Not necessarily like that, but you could, on the other hand, you could say, well, maybe that started with Disney and it started with Wicked. The first
and maybe this audience would look at Sondheim more sympathetically.
Yeah, that's also a very good point. And of course, Lin-Manuel Miranda, and that's also one thing that I credit him for, praises the people that came before him. Stephen Sondheim, but also Phantom, but also Les Mis. He knows his musical theatre history, Gilbert and Sullivan. He knows what he's doing. And he, in a way, is very generous.
I think that's the best thing about this piece, that if it was written by purely hip-hop people, it wouldn't be as strong. I know there are flaws, but it wouldn't be as strong. I think the songs are good. Now, you said you think some of the songs...
I'm not sure about all of the songs, especially the ones...
I mean, there's about 55 of them.
Oh, no, there's an enormous amount of songs, and some that I really like. And
The Room Where It Happens is a wonderful song.
It's a wonderful song. And of course, it's also clearly modelled on Someone in the Tree from Pacific Overtures. But once again, he is honest enough to acknowledge that and says, I've taken this and given it my own spin. And nobody would, that's what artists do, and that's wonderful. So I think...
I think the ending is very moving as well, how it doesn't end on a big... bang, it does.
I think there are a lot of moments that I feel are very, very touching, and there are a lot of moments where I thought this is really touching people emotionally. But on the other hand, you do wonder if the people who sit there crying for 3 hours, usually the people actually not who paid $900, but the ones who won the lottery, whether they would be doing that if it wasn't a show that has such value as a status symbol. So if you would say, I caught the second touring production in Omaha, then you just think, well, clearly that might not have quite the same prestige.
Well, I think those people are crying because they got in, not because of the show.
Yeah.
I think it's, and I said this before, I think it's certainly the biggest example of a 21st century musical, ironically, even though it goes back to the 18th century, with the whole emphasis on the music, obviously. The staging is, I want to say in my ignorance, it's very modern, but it probably isn't. It probably is. Robert would be able to answer that. But
it's using stuff that Frantic Assembly, who now Stephen Doggett does choreograph on Broadway, but Frantic Assembly were doing this in the early 2000s, this kind of movement.
Slow motion and things.
Yes. And it's in terms of contemporary real choreography in dance, modern dance, it's very old-fashioned.
And things like no tickets, and it's all digital, and it's all... I think it and the hype, obviously, it's hyped up because of the internet. I think if the show were to open in the 70s, I don't think it would be the massive hit.
Social media have made this show. I think you're right.
That's absolutely right. On the other hand, they have used social media brilliantly, and from Lin-Manuel Miranda, constantly tweeting, to the way they had the Hamilton shows outside the theatre in New York.
The producers.
There's a lot of... You think that shows how you can use it. On the other hand... that shows how you can use the mass media now to bring in a young audience. But I think also there is, there's potentially a danger of sort of going overboard. And I have to say, if there's one show that I found highly problematic coming in the wake of this, it is Dear Evan Hansen, which I think is a very problematic show. And its use of social media in the plot, and then also, of course, outside the theatre, begs a lot to be questioned.
It'll be dated in 5 years.
It's not just that it's dated, it's actually rather naive about the way the internet works and or the social media works. And it also, in the end, doesn't really have any high stakes, because at the end of Dear Evan Hansen, nothing has happened. The guy has lied, yes, but did it have any consequences? No, not really. Nobody exposed him. He wasn't bullied. He wasn't sort of...
I haven't seen it. You're giving away the plot twist.
I'm sorry, there is no real plot to that, I have to say. And of course, also, it's incredibly sentimental with something like You Will Be Found. And you think, well, sorry, that at least... Lin-Manuel Miranda may not always be hard-hitting, but he clearly has... he knows what he wants to do. And so with that, I think it's a far more exciting show when it comes to bringing something over than many of the later shows.
For more information about Musical Talk, please visit our website at musicaltalk.co.uk. You can email us at feedback@musicaltalk.co.uk, listen to past episodes on iTunes and YouTube, and follow our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.